Most people's understanding of what a cartel hitman actually is comes from a Netflix show. That is not an accusation. It is just the reality of how information moves in the modern world. Narcos was watched by tens of millions of people across more than 190 countries. It won awards. It launched careers. It made Pablo Escobar's name recognizable to an entire generation that was not alive when he was operating. But the people who made Narcos said something important before the first episode even finished. They called their own show magical realism. Half real, half invented. A highly detailed, realistic setting invaded by things too convenient and too clean to be true. What you are about to hear is the other half, the part that did not make it onto the screen because it was too large, too ugly, and too relentless to fit inside a dramatic framework designed to keep people watching. The real cartel hitmen were worse. Here is the documented proof. Section 1. The show's own creators admitted. It was 50-50 fiction. Most people who watched Narcos on Netflix walked away believing they had just seen history. The show felt real. It used actual news footage, real locations, real names. The DEA agents who hunted Pablo Escobar appeared in interviews promoting it. It had the visual texture of a documentary. But the people who made the show said something very different about what it actually was. Narcos showrunner Eric Newman publicly described the series as a 50-50 dramatization, half real, half invented. He encouraged viewers to Google the events depicted so they could compare what the show presented against what actually happened. That single statement should have changed how millions of people watched it. It did not. The show announced its own fictional license in the very first episode. Before any character appeared on screen, Narcos defined itself using the term magical realism, a literary concept describing stories where fantastical or invented elements are woven so seamlessly into a realistic setting that audiences cannot tell the difference. That was the creative framework the writers chose for a show millions of people accepted as historical fact. The invented elements were not small details. They were central to the entire story. Day agent Javier Peña, played by Pedro Pascal across 3 seasons and positioned as the emotional spine of the show, was not involved in investigating the Cali cartel at all. In reality, Peña left Colombia in October 1994, before the Cali investigation was in full swing. His presence in Season 3, hunting the Cali cartel godfathers, was entirely made up by the writing team. The real Peña confirmed this in interviews. The show kept him because Pedro Pascal had become too popular to write out, so they rewrote history instead. Character names were changed throughout the series. La Kika, one of Escobar's most feared real hitmen, was given a fictional name on screen. Navegante's real name was Cesar Yusti, not the name used in the show. Escobar's sicario and driver, known as El Limón, was called John Burgess in Narcos. His actual name was Álvaro de Jesus Agudelo. These were not minor legal technicalities. These were the people carrying out the real murders the show dramatized, and even their identities were altered. The death of José Santa Cruz Londoño, one of the 4 Cali cartel godfathers, was shown in Season 3 as a killing carried out by paramilitary leader Carlos Castaño Gil. In reality, Londoño was shot and killed by Colombian police after escaping prison. He was a fugitive with a $2 million bounty on his head when he died in a gun battle with authorities in 1996. The show gave his death a different killer for dramatic effect. Pablo Escobar's brother, Roberto Escobar, was entirely absent from Seasons 1 and 2, despite being the co-founder and accountant of the Medellin cartel, one of the most important figures in its actual financial operation. Roberto later demanded Netflix pay him $1 billion for using his family's story. The show had constructed a version of the Medellin cartel that left out one of its founding architects. The Colombian men and women who actually lived through this era said the same thing consistently. The show got the broad shape of things right, but missed the scale entirely. A Colombian who grew up during the Escobar years described it plainly. Everything the series showed was true, but not in the same proportions. The real violence was worse than what the television show tried to communicate. That gap between the show's version and documented reality is not a small one. Narcos depicted Escobar as a singular, almost mythological figure, whose violence was dramatic and targeted. A war between a cartel and a government, played out through assassinations and car bombs. The actual record shows something far less cinematic. Medellin in the early 1990s was the most violent city on Earth by statistical measure. The murder rate reached 380 homicides per 100,000 residents per year. On a single weekend, 400 people could be killed. That was not the backdrop to a story. That was the story. And Narcos, by its own creator's admission, only captured half of it. What the show built was a commercially viable, internationally palatable version of events that was compelling enough to win awards and generate sequels, but distant enough from ground-level reality that it never made audiences genuinely uncomfortable. The violence in Narcos is stylized. It has music behind it. It has camera angles. In the actual Medellin of that era, the violence had none of that. It was the sound of a motorcycle engine, 2 shots, and a body in the street that nobody in the neighborhood dared to look at. The show was not a lie, but it was not the truth either. It was something the creators themselves defined before the first episode finished. Magical realism. A highly detailed, realistic setting invaded by things too convenient, too dramatic, and too neatly resolved to be real. Every section that follows is about what was actually real. The people, the methods, the numbers, and the systems that Narcos either softened, invented, or left on the cutting room floor entirely because they were too ugly to make good television. The show gave viewers a version of the hitmen that made them watchable. The next section is about what those hitmen actually were. Not the leather-jacketed assassins on motorcycles, but children recruited from slums before they were old enough to finish school, handed weapons, and treated as disposable tools by the men who ran the cartels. Section 2. The real Sicario system was built on child soldiers. Pablo Escobar did not invent the hitman. Contract killers have existed across every culture and every century. What Escobar did was something different. He took the concept of the hired killer and industrialized it, using the most vulnerable and available resource in the slums of Medellin: teenage boys with nothing. The word sicario itself is not a modern invention. It comes from the Latin word sicarius, meaning dagger man, used in ancient Rome to describe assassins who killed with short blades hidden under their cloaks. By the time Escobar built his operation in the 1970s and 1980s, the word had been reborn in Colombia to describe something new. A generation of young men from the poorest neighborhoods of Medellin, recruited as teenagers, paid per kill, and treated as entirely expendable. These were not hardened criminals who found their way into cartel work after years in the underworld. They were boys. The neighborhoods Escobar targeted for recruitment, places like Comuna 13 in Medellin, were areas where the Colombian state had essentially stopped functioning. Schools were underfunded, work was non-existent, police were either absent or corrupt. Into that vacuum, the Medellin cartel moved like a parallel government, offering the one thing those communities had never reliably had: money and the appearance of status. A teenage boy in those neighborhoods could earn more from a single motorcycle assassination than his father might earn in months of legitimate work, if legitimate work was even available. The cartel understood this. The recruitment was not random. It was targeted, systematic, and built on an accurate reading of exactly how desperate those communities were. The pay for a single killing in 1980s Medellin was as low as $50. Some kills paid $100. For boys who had grown up with nothing, that was real money. And once you took the first payment, you were inside a system that did not let people leave quietly. The cartel knew where you lived. They knew your family. Leaving meant dying, and so most did not try. This was not a Colombian anomaly that ended with Escobar's death in December 1993. The system he built became the template that spread across Latin America and evolved into something even more difficult to dismantle. In Mexico, the child recruitment pipeline that Escobar pioneered in the 1980s became standard operating procedure for every major cartel that followed. By 2019, the Network for Children's Rights in Mexico estimated that 30,000 children were already working for Mexican cartels, in roles ranging from street-level lookouts to active hitmen. Another 250,000 were assessed to be at immediate risk of recruitment. Between the year 2000 and 2019, an estimated 21,000 children were murdered in Mexico, not as bystanders to cartel violence, but as direct participants in it, killed by rival organizations targeting the cartels they worked for. The recruitment methods evolved too. In Escobar's time, recruitment was done face-to-face in the barrios. By the 2020s, Mexican cartels were using video game platforms to reach children. Recruiters created gaming profiles in Mexican cities, sent invitations to players in a given geographic radius, and made contact with teenagers at 2 and 3 in the morning, hours when parents were asleep and children were online unsupervised. The messages were direct. They described the cartel lifestyle as glamorous, well-paid, and exciting. For a teenage boy sitting in a cramped house with no economic future visible to him, those messages landed. When the online contact worked, the next step was an in-person meeting. Those meetings frequently ended in abduction. The child who showed up curious was not allowed to go home and think about it. They were taken, transported to training locations, and absorbed into the organization, whether they had formally agreed or not. A 15-year-old boy named Juan, whose real name was withheld to protect him, described his path in an interview conducted at a youth correctional facility in Tijuana. He was recruited during his first semester of high school to sell methamphetamine. Less than a year later, older cartel members came to him after school with a new assignment. They gave him a gun and a photograph. He went to the location he was directed to and killed the person in the photograph. It was not even his first kill for the organization at that point. By the time he was arrested at 17, killing had become, in his own words, normal. He spent 2 years in a youth facility. He was 18 when he was released. That story, a child recruited through school contacts, handed a weapon, sent to kill, and absorbed so completely into the system that murder felt routine, is not an extreme outlier. It is documented as a pattern repeated across Mexico, Colombia, and Central America for decades. The cartels understood something that outsiders rarely acknowledged. Children made better soldiers for their purposes than adults in several specific ways. Children under 18 faced dramatically reduced legal consequences if caught in most jurisdictions. They were easier to manipulate psychologically. They had fewer attachments that might compete with loyalty to the organization. And they were cheaper. A teenager could be paid a fraction of what an adult enforcer would demand and feel wealthy by comparison given where he started. Narcos showed the sicarios as part of the scenery. Men on motorcycles, men with guns, men who carried out orders and occasionally got killed. The show never showed where they came from, how old they actually were, or what their lives looked like before the cartel found them. That omission was not accidental. Showing the actual recruitment of children into murder squads would have made the show unwatchable for a different reason than violence. It would have made the entire operation feel like what it actually was. Not a dramatic criminal empire, but a systematic abuse of the poorest and most vulnerable people in the hemisphere. The child soldiers in these cartels did not work alone. They operated inside a structure, a hierarchy of violence with specific roles, specific chains of command, and specific methods that were far more organized than anything Narcos depicted. The next section is about the actual death toll that structure produced, and the numbers behind it that the show never came close to communicating. Section 3. Escobar's real death toll dwarfs what the show depicted. Numbers are hard to feel. That is the problem with documenting what Pablo Escobar actually did to Colombia. The moment you start reciting statistics, the human reality behind them becomes abstract. So before the numbers, consider a single fact about daily life in Medellin at the peak of Escobar's power. Parents stopped putting their children's names on their school backpacks because they did not want kidnappers and killers to know what to call them when they approached. That was ordinary life. That was Tuesday. Narcos depicted Escobar's violence as dramatic and episodic. A justice minister assassinated on a highway, a presidential candidate shot dead at a campaign rally, a commercial airliner bombed from the sky. These events happened. They are documented. But the show presented them as the violence, the signature moments of a war between a cartel and a government. What it did not show was the volume, the relentless, daily, grinding murder rate that turned Medellin into the most statistically dangerous city on earth for nearly a decade. In 1991, Medellin recorded 6,349 murders. The city's population at the time was approximately 2 million people. That works out to roughly 17 people killed every single day in one city for an entire year. The homicide rate reached 380 deaths per 100,000 residents annually. To put that in context, a city is generally considered to be in a serious public safety crisis when its murder rate exceeds 50 per 100,000. Medellin was at 380. DEA agent Steve Murphy, who was physically present in Colombia during this period and is one of the real men whose story Narcos dramatized, described weekends where 400 people were killed. Not over a month, a weekend. Escobar did not personally pull the trigger in most of these deaths. He did not need to. He had built a structure specifically designed to multiply violence outward from a central source of money and instruction. At the core of that structure were the sicarios, the teenage boys described in the previous section. But the scale of the operation went far beyond individual killings on motorcycles. Escobar offered open bounties. He publicly announced that he would pay cartel members for killing police officers. The amounts varied, but the effect was immediate and measurable. Police officers began dying in large numbers, and young men from the comunas began hunting them for cash the way someone might pursue a financial reward. This was not a metaphor. It was a declared economic policy of murder. And it worked. Police officers in Medellin during the late 1980s and early 1990s had life expectancies that were brutally short. Many resigned. Others took the cartel's money and switched sides. The political killings Narcos dramatized were real, but the show captured only the most famous ones. In April 1984, Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla was shot dead by 2 motorcycle assassins while his car was moving through Bogotá. He had publicly challenged Escobar's attempt to enter legitimate politics and called him out by name. The killing was ordered within weeks of that confrontation. In 1989, presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán was gunned down in front of thousands of people at a campaign rally in the town of Soacha. Galán had been the frontrunner for the Colombian presidency and had made eliminating the cartels the centerpiece of his platform. Escobar had him killed in public in front of his supporters, to send the clearest possible message about what happened to people who threatened the operation. That same year, 1989, Escobar's organization bombed Avianca Flight 203. The target was Cesar Gaviria, a presidential candidate who had taken Galan's place on the ballot after Galan's assassination. Gaviria did not board the flight. The bomb killed all 107 people who did. Escobar bombed a civilian airliner, killed over 100 people, and did not hit his actual target. The operation was considered a failure internally. That calculation, that murdering 107 civilians was a failed mission because the one specific person he wanted was not among them, tells you more about the actual nature of the organization than any scene in Narcos. Chon Jairo Velázquez Vázquez operated as Escobar's primary executioner for years. His alias was Popeye. Before he died of cancer in February 2020, he spoke publicly and in detail about what he had done. He claimed to have personally killed approximately 300 people and to have organized and ordered the deaths of more than 3,000 others. Even if those figures are partially inflated by the particular psychology of a man who spent decades in prison and built a public identity around his crimes, the documented record of his actions supports that he was responsible for an enormous number of deaths. He served 23 years in prison, was released in 2014, returned to prison in 2018 on new charges, and died while incarcerated. The overall death toll attributed to Escobar and the Medellin cartel varies depending on the source and methodology. The DEA's own estimates, communicated by Javier Peña, put the number of people killed during Escobar's reign between 10,000 and 15,000. Colombian researchers and human rights organizations have produced estimates ranging up to 30,000 when accounting for all deaths directly and indirectly connected to the cartel's operations during that period. One of Escobar's own sicarios, in an interview cited by Peña himself, suggested the number was closer to 50,000. None of these figures appeared on screen in Narcos. The show gave viewers a version of Escobar's violence that was dramatic enough to be entertaining and selective enough to be comprehensible. The actual record is neither. It is a set of numbers so large they become difficult to process. A city where 17 people died every day. A hitman who organized 3,000 deaths. A cartel that bombed a civilian aircraft as a routine tactical decision and considered it a failure because the specific target survived. Colombians who lived through it have said consistently that the show did not capture the scale. That is not a criticism of the filmmaking. Some things are simply too large for television to hold. The Medellin cartel's violence was built on poverty, recruited from slums, and measured in thousands of bodies. What came next in Mexico took that foundation and added something the original sicarios never had: formal military training, specialized weapons, and a command structure designed by soldiers. The next section is about the cartel that U.S.-trained special forces built from scratch. Section 4. Los Zetas. The cartel built by U.S.-trained special forces. There is a specific kind of irony embedded in the origin story of Los Zetas that no television show has ever fully captured, because it is genuinely difficult to make it sound believable. The United States government spent years and enormous resources training an elite unit of Mexican soldiers to fight drug cartels. Those soldiers then defected, joined a drug cartel, and used everything the U.S. military had taught them to become the most violent and technically sophisticated criminal organization in Mexican history. The people trained to fight the problem became the problem. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented by the U.S. military, the DEA, Mexican federal authorities, and multiple independent investigative journalists. The chain of events that created Los Zetas is one of the most thoroughly sourced origin stories in the history of organized crime. It begins in the mid-1990s with a Mexican Special Forces unit called the Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, known by its acronym GAFE. This was Mexico's elite airborne special forces group, the country's most highly trained military personnel, selected for physical and psychological fitness, trained in counterinsurgency, urban warfare, and advanced weapons systems.
Some of these men were sent to Fort Bragg in North Carolina, the home of U.S. Army Special Forces, where they received training from America's 7th Special Forces Group. A former U.S. Special Forces commander named Craig Deere, who later became a professor at the U.S. National Defense University, confirmed the specifics of what that training included. Map reading, communications, standard Special Forces tactics, and weapons training covering light to heavy arms, including machine guns and automatic weapons. The purpose of training these Mexican soldiers was to prepare them to fight drug traffickers. That was the stated mission. They were supposed to return to Mexico as a counter-narcotics force capable of going up against the cartels on equal technical footing. In 1997, a Gulf cartel boss named Osiel Cardenas Guillen took control of the organization after a violent internal power struggle. Cardenas Guillen found himself immediately at war. Rival cartels were moving against his territory, and the Mexican army was conducting operations against his organization simultaneously. He needed protection that was better than anything the Gulf Cartel currently had. A former soldier in his network named Arturo Guzman de Sena, who had served in GAFE and carried the internal radio designation Z1, presented a solution. He knew where to find men with the specific training Cardenas Guillen needed. Guzman de Sena made contact with former GAFE colleagues and began recruiting. The pitch was straightforward. The Mexican military paid its special forces soldiers poorly. The Gulf Cartel would pay significantly more, provide better equipment, and offer a level of operational autonomy that military service never allowed. The name Los Zetas came from the radio call signs those original members had used in the military, all beginning with the letter Z, the Spanish word for which is Zeta. The initial group numbered somewhere between 31 and 34 men, though some estimates go higher. These were not street-level recruits. They were trained commandos who understood small unit tactics, knew how to plan and execute coordinated operations, could handle military-grade weapons, and had experience in surveillance and intelligence gathering. When they transitioned from protecting the Mexican state to protecting a drug cartel, they brought all of that with them. The effect was immediate and measurable. Los Zetas did not operate the way other cartel enforcers operated. They conducted surveillance before operations. They identified vulnerabilities in targets' routines. They planned escape routes. They used encrypted communications. They moved like soldiers because they were soldiers. And their targets, rival cartel members, police officers, government officials, had no equivalent training or preparation for what they were facing. The Combating Terrorism Center at West Point published an analysis of Los Zetas that described their early operational philosophy in precise terms. The three most trusted men in the organization led missions across Tamaulipas to execute rivals, and their training ensured a high operational success rate. Those operations were frequently followed by what the analysis called acts of barbarism, deliberate displays of extreme violence designed to function as psychological warfare. Los Zetas understood from their military training that controlling territory requires more than physical force. It requires making the population and rival organizations afraid to resist. The violence was not just violence, it was communication. As the organization expanded beyond its original 31 to 34 founding members, it needed to train new recruits. The Zetas solved this problem by recruiting the Caibailes, Guatemalan Special Forces soldiers with a reputation so brutal that military experts had given them a specific informal designation as killing machines.
The Caibiles were brought in to set up training camps across Mexico, where new Zetas recruits between the ages of 15 and 18 were put through military-style preparation before being deployed. The training infrastructure the Zetas built was specifically noted by Mexican defense authorities as resembling the setup of actual GAFE military training facilities. By 2010, Los Zetas had established a presence in 17 of Mexico's 32 states, making them the largest drug cartel in Mexico by geographic footprint at that time, surpassing even the Sinaloa cartel. The DEA and the Mexican government jointly declared the Zetas the primary enemy of the state that same year. The U.S. government described them as the group with the most advanced and sophisticated technology operating in Mexico. What Narcos Mexico depicted was cartel violence as a product of greed, ambition, and brutality. What Los Zetas represented was something the show's framework could not accommodate: a criminal organization whose violence was technically sophisticated because it had been built by people trained at the expense of the U.S. taxpayer to do exactly what they were doing, just for a different employer. The soldiers who built Los Zetas did not arrive at their methods through criminal intuition. They had been taught. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Understanding how Los Zetas were built explains the infrastructure, but it does not explain how cartels keep finding new members to replace the ones who are killed or imprisoned. The next section goes inside the actual recruitment pipeline, the specific methods cartels use today to pull people in, and why so few of them ever find a way back out. Section 5. The real recruitment pipeline Narcos never showed you. Narcos depicted cartel recruitment as a transaction between adults. A man with money approaches a man without it, offers a job, and the second man accepts. The exchange is simple, the choice appears voluntary, and the recruited person enters the organization as a conscious participant. That version of events is accurate for a narrow slice of cartel membership. The accountants, the lawyers, the mid-level logistics people who genuinely chose the money over a legitimate career. For the people doing the actual killing, the reality of how they got there looks almost nothing like that. The recruitment systems that cartels have built and refined over decades are designed around one core principle: find people with no good options and make yourself their only option. Everything else, the specific methods, the platforms, the promises made, flows from that principle. In Medellin during the 1980s, the process was geographic. Escobar's recruiters operated directly inside the comunas, the dense, poor hillside neighborhoods that ringed the city, where the Colombian state had the least presence and the cartel had the most influence. Young men in those neighborhoods grew up watching older boys they knew personally get recruited, get money, get motorcycles, and get respect. The cartel was visible, present, and financially successful in a context where legitimate success was essentially invisible. Recruitment did not require a formal pitch. It required proximity and patience. The cartel waited, and the neighborhood delivered. The men who recruited for Escobar understood that the first kill was the critical moment. Once a teenage boy had committed a murder for the organization, he was inside it in a way that could not be undone. He could not go to the police. He could not leave without the cartel deciding what to do about someone who knew operational details and had participated in a homicide. The first kill was not just an initiation. It was a mechanism of permanent entrapment. Academic research into sicario psychology, including interviews conducted with former cartel hitmen, confirmed that most sicarios did not know the identity of their first victim. They were given a location and a description or a photograph. The killing was impersonal by design. It was easier to carry out, and it meant the new recruit had no personal connection to the target that might cause hesitation. The first murder was engineered to be as psychologically manageable as possible because the organization needed to get the recruit past that threshold before he had time to fully process what was being asked of him. By the time the cartels reached Mexico and expanded through the 2000s and 2010s, the recruitment infrastructure had become more sophisticated and geographically broader. Los Zetas hung actual recruitment banners in rural areas. The banners were direct. They were addressed to soldiers and former soldiers and listed specific benefits: good salary, food, housing, and care for the recruit's family. The message was explicitly military in its framing. The cartel positioned itself as a better employer than the Mexican army, which paid its soldiers poorly and offered limited career advancement. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, known as the CJNG, moved the recruitment operation onto social media. Facebook pages and Instagram accounts run by cartel affiliates showed young men carrying weapons, wearing military-style gear, and projecting an image of power and financial success. A Wall Street Journal investigation found that Facebook's own internal teams had identified CJNG recruitment pages and flagged them for removal. Despite those warnings from specialists inside the company, the pages remained active for up to 5 months before being taken down. When they were removed, new ones appeared within days. The video game recruitment method emerged as cartels recognized that teenage boys were spending hours online in gaming environments with limited adult supervision. Recruiters created player profiles located in Mexican cities and sent friend requests or direct messages to players currently online within a specific geographic radius. The messages came in the early hours of the morning, 2, 3, 4 a.m., when parents were asleep. They described cartel membership in terms calibrated to appeal to a teenage boy: money, respect, brotherhood, excitement. The vast majority of recipients ignored them. A small number responded. For an organization operating across an entire country, a small percentage of a large number of contacts was enough. When online contact led to an in-person meeting, the voluntary nature of the recruitment frequently ended there. Young men who showed up, curious about what was being offered, were in multiple documented cases abducted and transported to cartel-controlled locations. At that point, the choice had been removed. The organization had them, knew their face, knew where they lived, and the only question that remained was what role they would perform. The Colombian pipeline into Mexico added another layer to this system. Mexican cartels, particularly the CJNG, began running fake job advertisements on social media targeting Colombian civilians and former military personnel. The advertisements offered legitimate-sounding employment, security work, logistics, administrative positions, with salaries that were genuinely attractive by Colombian standards. Men who responded and accepted were transported to Mexico, where the real nature of the job was revealed after arrival. Multiple Colombian men who went through this process and survived to speak about it described the same sequence: a promise of legitimate work, transport to Mexico, confiscation of documents, and forced integration into cartel operations under threat of death. One man named Andrés, a 36-year-old former Colombian soldier with combat experience against the FARC guerrilla group, described being told he was going to do accounting work. He arrived in Mexico and ended up working for the CJNG. A 27-year-old Colombian soldier named Smith described being given a vest marked with the Jalisco New Generation Cartel name, taken to a location with a pool where he was forced to interact with sex workers, handed weapons, and taken into the mountains to fight. Neither man had agreed to any of that. The agreement they had made was for a different job in a different country. The recruitment pipeline is not a single method. It is a system with multiple entry points, all of which converge on the same outcome: a person absorbed into an organization they cannot leave, performing tasks they cannot refuse, in a context where the legal system offers them no realistic protection. Getting into a cartel is a trap with many doors
and no exits. But the question most people watching Narcos never thought to ask is what the men actually doing the killing were being paid. The next section has that answer, and it is a number that makes the glamour the show depicted look like a deliberate and calculated lie. Section 6. The average sicario's pay was criminally low. Narcos made cartel life look expensive. The houses were large, the cars were new, the clothes were good.
Pablo Escobar in the show moved through a world of visible, excessive wealth. Private zoos, fleets of aircraft, mansions with their own soccer fields. The Cali cartel godfathers were depicted as men who had embedded themselves so legitimate Colombian society that their money was invisible in the best possible way. The overall visual language of the show communicated a consistent message. This world pays well. For the men at the top, that was true. For the people doing the killing, it was one of the most consequential lies the show told. Not through a specific invented scene, but through the cumulative effect of depicting a world where violence produced wealth for the people committing it. The documented pay rate for a street-level sicario in 1980s Medellin was between $50 and $100 per kill. Not per week, not a salary, per kill. A teenage boy would be given a target, a weapon, and a motorcycle. He would ride to the location, carry out the assassination, ride back, and receive somewhere between $50 and $100 for the act of ending a human life. If the target was a police officer during a period when Escobar was running open bounties for dead cops, the payment might be higher. But the base rate for a standard contracted killing was at that level consistently throughout the cartel's most active years. To understand what $50 meant in that context, it is worth being specific. In the comunas of Medellin in the late 1980s, that amount represented more than many family members earned in legitimate work over a comparable period. The cartel understood the math of poverty with precision. They did not need to offer a living wage by any reasonable standard. They needed to offer more than nothing, more than what the alternative provided, and more than what the recruit's father or brother was making through whatever legal work was available.
$50 cleared that bar. That was the entire economic logic of the system. The pay did not scale meaningfully with experience. A sicario who had carried out dozens of kills was not earning significantly more than one who had carried out his first. The cartel had no incentive to increase wages for people who had no ability to negotiate, no competing offers, and no exit option. The organization held all the leverage, and it used that leverage to keep its operational costs for violence as low as the market would bear. The market bore extremely low costs because the supply of desperate young men was effectively unlimited. What the money bought in practice was not the lifestyle depicted in Narcos. It bought food. It bought contributions to a family household that desperately needed the income. In some cases, it bought small visible markers of status within the neighborhood: new shoes, a better phone, the ability to pay for things that peers could not.
Those markers mattered in a social environment where having nothing was the baseline, and having anything at all was notable. But they were a long distance from the mansions and the luxury vehicles the show used to represent cartel prosperity. The financial structure of a cartel resembles a pyramid with an extremely steep slope. At the very top, a small number of people accumulated wealth that was genuinely extraordinary. Escobar's estimated net worth at the peak of his operation was $30 billion. The men immediately below him, the senior lieutenants and plaza bosses who managed territory and operations, earned enough to live visibly well. Every level below that saw the money decrease sharply. By the time you reached the street-level sicarios, the people whose physical actions the entire operation depended upon, the pay was at the bottom of the structure. This is not unique to the Medellin cartel. Academic research into Mexican cartel economics has consistently found the same pattern. The people carrying out the most dangerous and legally consequential work in the organization, the killings, the armed confrontations with rival cartels and military forces, the operations that carry the highest risk of death or imprisonment, are among the lowest compensated members of the structure. A cartel plaza boss managing a territory might earn tens of thousands of dollars per month. The sicarios working under him might earn a few hundred. The life expectancy attached to that pay made the economic picture worse. Researchers and journalists who have studied cartel membership consistently describe the average operational lifespan of a street-level sicario as short, measured in years rather than decades. The causes of death were consistent: killed by rival cartel members, killed by military or police forces, killed by their own organization when they became a liability or were suspected of disloyalty. The men who survived long enough to move up in the hierarchy were the exceptions. Most did not survive long enough to see their pay increase. The families of killed sicarios received no pension, no formal compensation, no organizational acknowledgement of the death beyond its operational implications. If a sicario was killed, the cartel's response was to find a replacement from the same pool of desperate young men in the same neighborhood.
The dead man's family was left with whatever he had managed to send home during the period he was alive, and nothing more.
Narcos constructed a world where the violence of cartel life was connected to visible, tangible reward for the people committing it. That connection made the choices of cartel members legible to a television audience, comprehensible as a rational trade between risk and reward. The actual economic reality of street-level cartel membership was a $50 payment for a killing, a short life spent in danger, and a family left with nothing when it ended. The glamour was real for approximately 24 people at the top of the structure. For the thousands of young men below them who made that structure function, it was a story told to make recruitment easier. The low pay and short life expectancy of the average sicario raises a question the show also never answered honestly. Who specifically were the men doing the killing? What did they actually say about it? And what did their confessions reveal about the mechanics of real cartel murder that no dramatization has ever captured? The next section goes directly to those confessions. Section 7. The Popeye Reality. Confessions Narcos couldn't touch. Narcos built its hitmen from composite parts. The show's sicarios were dramatic constructions, dangerous, visually compelling, psychologically simple. They existed to advance the plot and represent the cartel's capacity for violence without requiring the audience to sit with anything too uncomfortable for too long. They appeared, they killed, they disappeared. The show never had to answer for what they actually thought, how they actually operated, or what carrying out hundreds of murders over years did to a person's internal experience of reality. The real hitmen gave interviews. Some of them built public platforms. Some wrote books. Some sat in front of cameras while still serving prison sentences and described, in plain and specific language, exactly what they had done and how they had done it. That material exists. It is documented. And it describes a reality that no television dramatization has come close to capturing. John Jairo Velázquez Vázquez was Pablo Escobar's primary executioner. His alias was Popeye, a nickname he acquired early in his criminal career. He worked directly under Escobar for years, carrying out killings personally and organizing the deaths of others on Escobar's instruction. He was arrested after Escobar's death in 1993 and sentenced to prison in Colombia. He served 23 years. He was released in 2014. He was returned to prison in 2018 on new extortion charges. He died of stomach cancer in February 2020 while incarcerated. During the years between his first release and his death, Popeye became publicly visible in a way that surprised observers. He launched a YouTube channel. He gave long interviews. He appeared on Colombian television programs.
He spoke about his crimes with a directness that was not quite remorse and not quite pride. Something more like a man providing a factual account of a profession he had practiced for a long time. He claimed to have personally killed approximately 300 people. He claimed to have organized and ordered the deaths of more than 3,000 others. He described Escobar as an employer who issued kill orders the way a manager might issue work assignments, by phone, routinely, without ceremony or elaboration. What Popeye described about the operational mechanics of killing for the Medellin cartel contradicted almost everything about how Narcos depicted it.
The show presented assassinations as tense, dramatic, carefully constructed scenes with build-up and consequence. Popeye described a process that was bureaucratic in its regularity. A name would come down, a location and a routine would be established through surveillance. The kill would be carried out. The kill would be confirmed. Life continued. The next name would come down. The emotional weight that television attached to each killing, the close-up on the victim's face, the dramatic score, the aftermath, did not correspond to how the people doing the killing experienced it on a week-to-week basis. It was work, repetitive, routinized, and eventually ordinary. The psychological normalization that Popeye described was not unique to him. It appeared consistently across documented accounts from other former cartel members who spoke about their experiences. A former Mexican sicario, known in interviews only as Drago, a former police officer who worked as a hitman between 1997 and 2001, whose full confession was documented in a book by journalist Guadalupe Reina, described the same process of normalization. Drago said that most of the time, a sicario did not know who his victims were. He was given coordinates, a description, sometimes a photograph. The killing was impersonal by organizational design. His account of his first kill placed him at 16 years old. He described the moment as a turning point from which his experience of his own life changed permanently. Dandini Muñoz Mosquera operated as one of Escobar's most senior and trusted hitmen. His alias within the organization was La Kika. Narcos changed his name for the show. The real man was responsible for one of the single deadliest acts carried out by the Medellin cartel. On November 27, 1989, Avianca Flight 203 departed Bogotá's El Dorado International Airport, bound for Cali. Shortly after takeoff, a bomb placed on the aircraft by La Kika's operation detonated. The plane broke apart in the air and crashed near the town of Suacha. All 107 people on board were killed. An additional 3 people on the ground died from debris impact. The intended target was Cesar Gaviria, the Liberal Party presidential candidate, who had taken over the campaign after Luis Carlos Galán was assassinated in August of that year. Gaviria had been scheduled to be on the flight. He did not board. The bomb killed every person who did, and Gaviria survived. La Kika was later convicted in the United States on multiple counts related to the bombing and other killings. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences. He has been incarcerated in the United States for more than 30 years. He will die in prison. The gap between La Kika as depicted in Narcos, a dangerous but ultimately secondary figure in the show's narrative architecture, and La Kika as documented in the historical record, is significant. The show could not fully represent what it meant that one of Escobar's hitmen had bombed a civilian aircraft, killed 107 people in a single operation, and was then immediately available for the next assignment. Making that fully real for an audience would have required the show to abandon the dramatic conventions that made it watchable. The confessions and documented accounts of real sicarios share a quality that television cannot reproduce. They describe violence at a scale and with a regularity that moves beyond drama into something closer to industrial process. The men who did this killing were not the tormented anti-heroes that prestige television requires. They were people who had been recruited young, normalized to murder through repetition, and kept inside a system that removed every alternative.
What they described when they finally spoke was not dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was ordinary. The confessions describe how the killing felt from the inside.
The next section examines the specific method that became the signature of cartel violence during the Escobar era, the motorcycle assassination, and what the actual documented record reveals about how systematically and at what volume it was deployed in ways the show depicted as dramatic set pieces, but never as the industrial operation it actually was. Section 8. The motorcycle method. Reality behind the most iconic scene. The image is probably the most recognizable visual shorthand for cartel violence in popular culture. Two men on a motorcycle moving through traffic, the passenger turning to fire, the bike accelerating away before anyone can respond. Narcos used it. Every cartel film and television series uses it. It has become so embedded in the visual grammar of crime drama that audiences process it as a genre convention, a stylistic signature of the world being depicted, like a tracking shot in a heist film or a slow-motion explosion in an action movie. What that familiarity has done is strip the method of its actual operational logic. The motorcycle assassination in Narcos is a dramatic device. In Medellin during the late 1980s and early 1990s, it was a logistics solution to a specific operational problem, deployed at a frequency and volume that has no equivalent in anything the show depicted. The problem the cartel needed to solve was simple. How do you kill a large number of people quickly, cheaply, and with a low probability of the killer being caught or identified? A car is slower in urban traffic, more visible, harder to park and escape from, and more expensive to replace when it is connected to a crime. A motorcycle moves through traffic in ways a car cannot. It can be abandoned quickly. The rider and passenger can separate on foot in a dense neighborhood and disappear into familiar territory within seconds of the shooting. In a city like Medellin, where the cartel controlled entire comunas, and where residents had been made to understand that cooperating with police investigations had serious consequences, the escape window needed to remain open for only a short time. The method was also cheap to operationalize. A motorcycle cost a fraction of a car. The weapons used were typically handguns or short automatic weapons that could be concealed under clothing during the approach and disposed of quickly afterward. The two-man team required minimal coordination, a driver and a shooter, roles that could be filled by teenage boys from the same neighborhood who had grown up together. Training for the specific physical act of the shooting was minimal. The cartel was not optimizing for precision. It was optimizing for volume and deniability. DEA. Agent Steve Murphy, one of the real agents whose story Narcos dramatized, and who was physically present in Medellin during this period, described the motorcycle killing method in direct terms. He said the two-man motorcycle team was one of the cartel's favorite methods. They would shoot the target, take off, and disappear into traffic. The statistics in Medellin, he said, were simply unbelievable in terms of how many people were being killed. Murphy was not describing a cinematic technique. He was describing something he witnessed repeatedly as a feature of daily life in the city where he was stationed. Escobar accelerated the deployment of this method by introducing an economic incentive that functioned as an open market for violence. He announced publicly that the Medellin cartel would pay bounties for killed police officers. The amounts varied across different periods of the conflict between the cartel and the Colombian state. But the existence of the bounty system is documented and was widely known within Medellin at the time. What this created was not a directed assassination program where the cartel identified specific targets and assigned specific teams. It was an open invitation to anyone willing to kill a police officer to bring confirmation of the kill and collect payment. The practical effect was that young men from the comunas began hunting police officers independently, outside of any specific cartel operation, purely for the payment.
Police officers in Medellin during the peak years of the bounty system faced a threat environment that had no clear source and no predictable pattern. Any motorcycle passing them in traffic was a potential threat. Any two young men visible on a bike in their vicinity represented a possibility that had to be assessed in real time, with no information about whether those specific individuals had accepted the bounty or were simply riding a motorcycle. The psychological pressure on the police force was part of the cartel's intent. Many officers resigned. Others took the cartel's money and stopped being a threat in a different way. The Colombian government's response to the motorcycle assassination problem eventually included legislation restricting the operation of motorcycles in certain areas and at certain hours, a regulatory response to a killing method that had become so prevalent it required a legal framework to address. That is the scale at which the method was operating. It was not a dramatic set piece deployed for key moments in the cartel's conflict with authorities. It was common enough that the government had to write laws specifically because of it. The victims of motorcycle assassinations during the Escobar era were not primarily the high-profile targets that Narcos focused on. Justice ministers and presidential candidates appeared in the show because they made for dramatic television. The documented record of motorcycle killings in Medellin during the late 1980s and early 1990s shows that the majority of victims were police officers, low-level rivals, people who owed money to cartel-connected operations, witnesses to cartel activity, and ordinary civilians who were in the wrong place at the wrong time when a young man with a gun on a motorcycle made a mistake about identity or simply did not care about the distinction. The Avianca bombing killed 107 people and became internationally documented because it involved a commercial aircraft. The motorcycle killings happened at a rate of multiple incidents per day across Medellin for years and generated almost no international attention because each individual incident was small enough to be processed as local crime statistics rather than as evidence of a system operating at industrial scale. Narcos showed you the motorcycle. It showed you the dramatic version, a specific target, a specific team, a specific moment of violence that advanced the plot. It did not show you the same method deployed 17 times in a single day across a single city, by different teams of boys, for $50 a kill, against targets whose names the shooters frequently did not know before they pulled the trigger. The motorcycle method made the violence in Colombia feel local and contained. What happened next took the same organizational logic and exported it across an international border, recruiting soldiers from one country to fight cartel wars in another. The next section documents that pipeline as it operates today and why it represents something the Narcos franchise never addressed because it was still developing while the show was being made. Section 9. The Colombian soldiers being lured to Mexico. Today, Narcos ended its story in the 1990s. The Medellin cartel fell. The Cali cartel was dismantled. The DEA agents flew home. The credits rolled. For the audience, the story had a conclusion, messy and incomplete in the way real history always is, but finished. What the franchise never addressed, because it could not, was what came after. The organizational logic that Escobar built, the recruitment systems, the violence as infrastructure model, did not disappear when the Colombian cartels were broken up. It migrated, it evolved, and in its current form, it is operating across international borders in ways that are more sophisticated and harder to disrupt than anything the show depicted. The specific pipeline documented here involves Colombian soldiers, men with real military training, combat experience against one of the world's most active guerrilla forces, and professional skills that make them valuable in a very specific market. Being recruited by Mexican cartels through deception and transported across an international border to fight cartel wars they never agreed to participate in. This is not historical, it is current. Multiple Colombian men who went through this process and survived gave detailed accounts to the Mexican newspaper El Universal.
Their testimonies were corroborated by Colombian police, the Colombian Ombudsman's office, and investigative journalists working the story from both sides of the border. The recruitment mechanism begins on social media. Mexican cartels, particularly the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, known as the CJNG, post job advertisements on platforms including Facebook and Instagram, targeting Colombian civilians and former military personnel. The advertisements are constructed to appear legitimate. They offer specific salaries, in documented cases, figures around 10 million Colombian pesos per month, which converts to over $2,000 and represents a genuinely attractive income by Colombian standards. The listed job descriptions involve security work, logistics, or administrative roles. The advertisements mention housing and meals as included benefits. Nothing in them references drug cartels, armed conflict, or criminal activity. Men who respond and are selected go through what appears to be a normal hiring process. They receive communication from people representing themselves as legitimate employers. Travel to Mexico is arranged and paid for. The men board flights, believing they are going to legitimate employment. Some of them brought nothing more than what they would pack for a work trip. The moment they arrived in Mexico, the reality of what they had been recruited into became clear. Documents were taken. The promised jobs did not exist. Instead, the men were absorbed directly into cartel operations. A 36-year-old former Colombian soldier named Andrés, who had combat experience fighting the FARC guerrilla organization, described his experience in direct terms. He was told the work involved accounting. He ended up involved with both the Viagras criminal group and the CJNG. A 27-year-old Colombian soldier from the Huila department named Smith described what happened immediately after arrival. He and other Colombians were given vests marked with the Jalisco New Generation Cartel name. They were taken to a house with a pool where they were forced to have relations with sex workers. They were given weapons. Then they were taken into the mountains to fight. Neither man had agreed to any of that. The agreement they had signed onto was for a different job in a different country. By the time the actual situation was clear, they were inside Mexico, inside cartel-controlled territory, without their documents, surrounded by armed men, and without realistic access to any institution that could help them. Local police in the areas where these operations occurred were frequently aware of what the cartels were doing, and in multiple documented cases, provided the cartels with transportation and weapons rather than intervening. The CJNG's interest in Colombian soldiers is specifically documented as strategic. Colombian military personnel are sought because the Colombian armed forces have decades of real combat experience against active guerrilla and paramilitary organizations. That experience produces soldiers with skills that are directly transferable to cartel warfare. Operating in mountainous jungle terrain, conducting ambushes, surviving extended armed engagements, and functioning under sustained operational pressure. One of the Colombian men who gave testimony stated that the CJNG was working toward assembling a group of 300 Colombian soldiers to deploy in conflicts in the states of Jalisco and Michoacán. The pipeline does not only target civilians who served in the military. The CJNG and Sinaloa cartel have also been documented recruiting former members of the FARC guerrilla organization who entered Colombia's peace process after the 2016 peace agreement. Those individuals have combat skills comparable to military personnel and are in many cases economically vulnerable after demobilization, making them susceptible to the same deceptive recruitment tactics used on former soldiers. The Colombian Police and Ombudsman's Office have explicitly identified this as a threat to Mexico's national security. What makes this pipeline particularly difficult to disrupt is that it exploits legitimate international labor migration as its cover.
A Colombian man booking a flight to Mexico for a job interview does not generate law enforcement attention. The deception operates in the space between a normal activity, seeking work abroad, and the criminal reality waiting at the destination. By the time the deception is apparent,
The recruited person is in another country under the physical control of an organization that kills people as a routine operational function. The men who survived and spoke about this experience represent a fraction of those who went through it. Others did not survive. Others are still inside the organizations they were deceived into joining, unable to leave without certainty of death, performing work they cannot refuse in a country where they have no legal standing, no documents, and no institutional protection. Narcos ended its story when the Colombian cartels fell. The actual story did not end. It crossed a border, put on a different name, learned new recruitment methods, and started using social media to find its next soldiers. The international recruitment pipeline shows how the cartel system adapts and expands across borders. But the dimension of this entire history that received the least attention in Narcos, the one that the documented record returns to again and again as the truest measure of what this system actually cost, is what it did to the children who were not recruited, but simply lived inside the geography where all of this was happening. The final section is about those children and the numbers behind them. Section 10. The scale of what Narcos left out. The children. There is a statistic buried in the records of Medellin's municipal coroner's office that does not appear in Narcos. It does not appear in any episode, any scene, any line of dialogue, or any of the documentary footage the show uses between dramatic sequences to signal that what you are watching is grounded in real events. The statistic is this. Between 1986 and May of 1993, 14% of all murders recorded in Medellin were children. The total number of child murder victims across that period was 4,766. In 1993 alone, the final year of Escobar's life, the year the show builds toward as its dramatic culmination, some government officials estimated that as many as 1,200 children were murdered in that single city in that single year. Narcos is a show about Pablo Escobar. It is also, by its own framing, a show about the human cost of the drug trade. It depicts violence extensively. It uses real death tolls as context. It presents itself as a serious engagement with a serious historical period. And across 3 seasons, it almost entirely avoided the dimension of that period that the documented record identifies as its most devastating long-term consequence: what the cartel era did to the children who grew up inside it. The children in Medellin during the Escobar years occupied one of 3 positions. Some were recruited, pulled into the Sicario system, handed weapons, and turned into killers before they were old enough to finish secondary school, as documented in earlier sections of this piece. Some were killed, murdered as direct victims of cartel violence, as bystanders to cartel operations, or as targets of the retaliatory violence that the cartel's war with the Colombian state generated throughout the city's poorest neighborhoods. And some survived, but surviving meant growing up in an environment where all of the above was normal, where 17 people dying on a given day was not remarkable, and where the psychological weight of sustained exposure to mass violence shaped a generation in ways that researchers were still documenting decades later. Human Rights Watch conducted field research in Medellin during this period and published findings that put specific numbers to what children were experiencing. By 1994, municipal authorities estimated that at least 3,000 children and young people belonged to militias operating in Medellin alone. Children were documented in roles as traqueteros, people who handled drug transactions, as well as bodyguards, drug mules, lookouts, and sicarios who carried out motorcycle assassinations. The organization of children into these roles was not incidental to the cartel's operation.
It was a deliberate structural choice based on the legal and operational advantages that using minors provided. A human rights activist who worked in Medellin during this period described the situation with a single sentence that appears in the Human Rights Watch documentation. Here, grandparents bury their grandchildren. That inversion, the oldest generation outliving the youngest, was not a poetic observation. It was a literal description of what was happening in the city's comunas on a sustained basis across multiple years.
The children who were killed were not killed selectively. The violence that the cartel generated did not operate with the kind of discrimination that would allow a child walking to school to be confident they were not in danger. Escobar's bounty system for killing police officers created a threat environment in which young men from the comunas were actively hunting uniformed officers throughout the city. Police officers responding to that threat treated young men from poor neighborhoods as presumptive threats. The resulting dynamic meant that children living in those neighborhoods existed in a crossfire between the cartel's offensive operations and the state's defensive ones, with neither side offering them meaningful protection. On November 15, 1992, 8 children and 1 adult were shot and killed in the Villatina neighborhood in eastern Medellin. The youngest victim was a girl named Johanna Mazo. She was 8 years old. The other victims, all boys, were members of a Christian youth group called Caminantes Constructores del Futuro, Walking Builders of the Future. They were not cartel members. They were not targets of a specific operation. They were children in a neighborhood where the distinction between combatant and civilian had effectively ceased to exist as an operational consideration for the people with guns. The Colombian Institute of Family Studies estimated that 1.2 million people, the majority of them children, were living with chronic trauma in cartel-affected regions throughout the 1990s. That figure does not describe people who had been shot or recruited. It describes people whose psychological development occurred inside an environment of sustained violence, where the constant presence of death, the sound of gunfire, the visibility of bodies, and the disappearance of neighbors and relatives were features of ordinary daily experience rather than exceptional events. In Mexico, the legacy of what Escobar built has produced numbers that in some respects exceed even the Colombian figures. Between 2000 and 2019, an estimated 21,000 children were murdered in Mexico. By 2019, 30,000 children were assessed to be actively working for cartels in operational roles. Another 250,000 were identified as being at immediate risk of recruitment. These are not projections or estimates built on limited data. They come from the Network for Children's Rights in Mexico, an organization that conducts direct field research and advocacy work across the country. The show Narcos ran for 3 seasons. It covered roughly 15 years of cartel history across Colombia and briefly into Mexico. In that time, it depicted the deaths of politicians, police officers, cartel members, DEA informants, rival traffickers, and innocent bystanders caught in specific dramatic moments. It gave those deaths weight, context, music, and close-ups. It constructed an emotional architecture around the violence that made it comprehensible and, in the way that prestige television requires, meaningful. What it did not do, could not do within its commercial and dramatic framework, was sit with 4,766 dead children in one city across 7 years. Could not make room for 1,200 child murders in a single year in a single city and treat that number with the gravity it required, rather than using it as backdrop. Could not show what it looked like for a generation of children to grow up in a place where dying young was not a risk, but a statistical probability. Narcos told you about the drug war. The children of Medellin and the children of Mexico lived inside it. And the distance between those two experiences is exactly the distance between what the show was and what actually happened. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.